I have not once gotten through it without breaking down. That there is something appropriate about this crowd being this size, because this is something very personal to me. And I'll get right to it. Because we're celebrating Dr. King's birthday, I want to share with you my favorite poem about Dr. King. It's called A Dead Man's Dream. Now that he is safely dead, let us praise him, build monuments to his glory, sing hosannas to his name. Dead men make such convenient heroes because they cannot rise to challenge the images that we would fashion from their lives. And besides, it's easier to build monuments than to build a better world. So now that he is safely dead, we with eased consciences will tell our children that he was a great man, knowing full well that the cause for which he lived is still a cause, and the dream for which he died is still a dream, a dead man's dream. And I'm sharing this poem in part out of frustration that it is our national pastime to misremember what Dr. King's legacy was really about. He was ostensibly about peace, and using peace as a means to get to social and economic equality. But he's been reduced to a saying, a phrase, I have a dream. But he was more than that, and so was Gordon Parks, another one of my heroes. In his book, Mr. Parks, if you don't know, he's a great photographer, writer, and filmmaker, tells his story about him choosing to respond to the violence and hate that he suffered here in Kansas as a child with a camera, with a typewriter, and with a brilliantly creative and curious mind. In that book he writes, even at 16, I was aware of the problems I faced, and quickly enough, I tried thinking about ways to survive. I should put a pin here and let you know that at this point in his life, his mother has died and he's left Kansas. And he's living on the streets in Minneapolis. He said, I wouldn't go back to my sisters, and the distance back to Kansas was insurmountable. I never thought of the Salvation Army or some other charity, yet there were other things I considered, and one of them was robbery. I came closest the morning of my 17th birthday, when I found myself alone on the trolley with an elderly conductor. He poked me awake and stood there just above me, holding a bundle of bills wadded together with a rubber band. At the sight of them, my hand tightened on the switchblade in my pocket. I rose slowly, looking around to see who was about. We were alone. The operator had already gone to the cafe across the street. The conductor turned away from me and walked toward the rear of the car. Perspiration rolled down from my armpits, and my anxiety must have shown on my face. I pressed the button, and the long blade popped out. Conductor! Yes. He turned and calmly stared at the blade. I looked back at him, trembling now with all of my mother's warnings coming hot at me. Conductor, I said, would you give me $1 for this knife? I'm hungry, and I don't have a place to stay. He continued to look at me for a moment. You can keep the knife, he said. Come over to the cafe, and I'll buy you a meal. Still shaking and not know what to do, I closed the blade. I'm sorry, I said. It's all right, he said, peeling off two $1 bills. Go where you want, get some grub. No, it's okay, I can manage. He insisted, take it. Take it and keep yourself out of trouble. I refused the money, jumped out of the car, and hurried away, more ashamed than I'd ever been in my entire life. I offer that passage from Gordon Parks as an example of how violence is often instinctual, a reaction, but peace is a choice, a courageous choice, a personal choice. So during this King holiday, I wanted to offer this presentation as an homage to both men and to their cause of peace and dignity. Though it may sound tragic, This is not a story of violence. It is a story of peace. Though it may sound heartbreaking, this is not a story of woe. And though it may sound like divine providence, this is a story about a choice of weapons. Before my cousin Ricardo lost his son Robert to one of the most bizarre acts of random violence Wichita had seen in years, Ricardo was celebrating. As an assistant basketball coach at Wichita Southeast High School, Ricardo had just watched his team win a City League title. That night was particularly satisfying because he watched this group of once selfish boys gel into a coolly efficient team, willing to sacrifice their own scoring and their profile for the benefit of the team. So, after a boisterous celebration in the locker room, Ricardo was headed out for a celebratory dinner. But that's when he got the call. The voice was hysterical, almost incoherent in its panic. Robert's been shot. Robert's been shot. You have to come to the hospital. Robert had actually cheered his dad on from the stands that night and was dropping off some friends after the game when he stopped at a traffic light. The young man in the car next to Robert's, a young man that we'd later learn was high and drunk and who later wouldn't even remember the incident, said he didn't like the way that Robert had looked at him. So he pulled out a gun and began firing at Robert's car. Bullets tore through Robert's elbow, then through both sides of his neck, severing his arteries. Clutching at his wounds and still trying to drive, Robert drove less than a block before jumping the curb in a residential area very close to Wesley Hospital. One of his friends in the car drove Robert the rest of the way to the hospital, but he died before Ricardo could get there. The case stunned the city. Hundreds of people filled St. Mark United Methodist Church in Wichita for Robert's funeral. The attention spoke to the kind of kid that Robert was, and to the fear such a wild, random shooting had stoked in the larger community. That attention extended to the trial and into the sentencing, where Ricardo came face to face with the child who had shot his child. He said he immediately began thinking about the similarities between the two young men. Each was someone's son or grandson, and what had happened was the focus of great pain in each family. And with the love and concern that Robert had received, perhaps this killer's path might be different. When asked by the judge if he had anything he wanted to say, Ricardo made a choice. And I'll stop here and I'll ask you to put yourself in his shoes. What would you do? How would you feel? What would you say? Just last week I heard a family ask a judge for a maximum sentence for the man who had killed their loved one. And I'm not going to stand here and claim that I wouldn't do the same thing if such a tragedy had struck my life. But I know that there's a God, because that's the only way Ricardo could have stood there that day and did what he did. With tears in his eyes, he pled for leniency for the young man. A move, he said, was inspired from a sudden and sincere outpouring of love and concern. Since then, he has crisscrossed the country, sharing his story of pain and forgiveness, encouraging young men tempted by gangs in the streets to take a different path. I've seen him with these kids. The same boys who couldn't sit still long enough for a teacher to teach them anything. They just sat transfixed by a story. And they weren't just listening. I'm looking at their faces. They were learning in the purest sense. They were taking in the story, injecting their own understanding, mixing in their own life experiences, processing it, and then returning quickly to Ricardo's next word, all in the span of a moment. They weren't just receiving a story, but they were participant, active listeners. The first time I heard his presentation, I didn't just cry, I sobbed. The great scholar and public intellectual Cornel West says truth cannot surface until suffering is allowed to speak. And suffering had spoken to Ricardo and to our family in such a painful and vulnerable eloquence. It has spoken in North Newton through the death of a 19-month-old baby. His mother, already having been sentenced to more than 3 years in prison for child abuse, and aggravated child endangerment. His mother's boyfriend claimed the toddler had fallen down the stairs the previous day. It spoke a few years ago in Tucson, where 6 people, including a 9-year-old girl, died. It was tragic, certainly, but dozens of people across America die every week to gun violence, and the country turns its back. It makes me wonder when we will choose different weapons. Ricardo met Robert when Robert was a toddler, and Ricardo began dating Robert's mother, Rosalind. Ricardo lured Robert to him with a potato chip, and pretty soon, the baby had made himself comfortable in Ricardo's lap. Before he left, Ricardo held the child out in front of him and smiled, and the baby smiled back, grabbed his face with his hands, and kissed Ricardo on the nose. This is who Ricardo had rushed to the hospital to see. Shortly after his arrival, we arrived at the hospital and were ushered into what the hospital ironically calls the quiet room. This is the place where the doctors and the police deliver to families the worst possible news. It's the place where the screaming begins, as it did that night. As the doctor emerged, with police department officials present, they explained to us that Robert had died, but we couldn't see him because his body was considered a crime scene. The fact that Rosalind and Ricardo couldn't see their son made his passing seem unreal, surreal. Ricardo told me later that his eyes swept the room, from the faces of his wife and mother-in-law who were screaming, to the face of the doctor, to the police officials, and then into his own trembling hands. It is unlikely, God willing, that too many of us here tonight will experience what Ricardo experienced. It is unlikely that we will have choices of our own to make. No, it is likely that we will have choices of our own to make. Moments when our suffering begins to speak and the truth of who we are begins to surface. And we can choose. We can choose. So we must choose our weapons wisely. Are we going to choose brute force, or as Dr. King suggests, soul force? Are we going to choose guns or grace, hate or our hearts? Ricardo chose after experiencing the unimaginable. And if he could do that, the rest of us have no excuse. Thank you.